Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. I am delighted to be here today again with the same dates. This is episode 46 of the PetroNerds podcast, and my guest and sort of co-host and interviewer and my fliparoo is Gabby Richmond. And if you didn't listen to the podcast episode last week, you really need to, because we talk a lot about China and talk about Europe and everything going on with the gas side and the very topical issues, and had a conversation on that. And today we're doing part two of this because it was a relatively long conversation. So we're doing part two, and we're going to talk more about the domestic stuff. And so Gabby Richmond is with the Denver Petroleum Club. She's awesome. And she's sort of the fliparoo. She's sort of interviewing me and asking the questions, and I'm sitting here. I truthfully, obviously, I study a lot, but I didn't know the questions and did not prepare. So we will see how this one goes. But to timestamp it, it is still Tuesday, April 26, 2022. We haven't seen the news because we've been in this room for a while, and it's about 9 p.m. So
at this point, I think we might just end up in here forever. I'm like, I don't know forever.
Things could change. There were some technical difficulties in getting things started, so we're really hoping that all these devices are still recording. But it's episode 46, Tuesday, April 26, 2022, part two with Gabby Richmond. Brent is still actually it's probably changed, but 106 for Brent, 102 for WTI, and just under $7, $6.85 for U.S. Henry Hub, and the Dutch TTF about $32. So with that, we've talked about the global oil market, or we've talked about China, not so much global oil market. We could keep going on that, but I was sort of leaning into the U.S. side before we paused. So take it away.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to put professional fliparoo on my LinkedIn title, I think, going forward, because I really love that. But you brought up Jen Psaki, and I think you brought up SPR, and I want to start there, that 180 million barrels, and I want to get your thinking on how much that's really going to help prices in the short term in the market, and kind of what your tentative forecast would be for the next couple months, if that's going to change WTI or any nat gas materially.
I think we've sort of seen it to the extent that it helped, and it did prove the same way Biden was able to increase nat gas prices by saying, hey, we're gonna support Europe in exporting, and is the same. I think he was hoping for a bigger dip on the oil market. And to be fair, I mean, this administration thought they were going to get a deal with Iran, or really wanted to get this nuclear deal with Iran, and so therefore Iran would be adding these barrels back, and that nuclear deal is not happening. It just seems dead in the water. And these hardliners in Iran have really prevented that. So I think that's really tricky for them. And so this coordinated SPR release with other countries, but largely the U.S. being 180 million barrels, is the largest by far. It's an extraordinary amount, and it's 1 million barrels per day. That 1 million barrels per day didn't seem to have I know we saw something about some cargo shipments leaving the U.S. from the SPR going abroad, but I haven't, the timing of which you're going to, basically how long it's going to go through at 1 million barrels per day. One, that is a direct offset to Iran of sort of adding these barrels back. But I think the market that already sort of took it and interpreted it, and it was what it was, which didn't impact the market that much. So 1 million barrels a day, the U.S. consumes about 20 million barrels per day. So that's a drop. I mean, it's not a drop in the bucket, but it's 1 million barrels per day out of a 20 million barrel day market. And then the U.S. is a 100 million the globe is a 100 million barrel day market. So that's 1 million barrels out of 100 million barrels. It's not a lot. It's more of a drop in the bucket there. And 180 million barrels is 1.8 days of global oil demand. And so it's helpful in the extent of you're trying to ease the pressure a little bit. But the reality is unless we have, and I would like to get into the demand side a bit more, but if demand cools, it'll be sort of a different story. But as you are going into your summer driving season, and if you have further volatility and issues with crude supplies, then you've guaranteed yourself a higher forward price, because those volumes won't be there, or theoretically they won't be, depending.
You're
gonna
have to buy it back eventually.
Right. And the signal from the White House was that they were bragging on themselves, because they were saying, hey, we're telling the producers we'll buy this back. And it's okay, well, that's the first thing you've done kindly to these producers.
Besides bad mouthing them on national TV.
So it's been, I think it's really quite that the piece is sort of quite messy, but the actual SPR release I think is pretty muted. And I think I don't know if it's, I would say, desperation on the administration's part, but it's definitely an attempt to one is shows that they don't really understand the oil and gas market, not just domestically but globally. And two, I think it's just not that the concept that they are going to really dent it is not necessarily going to work. Now, personally, I think demand is going to weaken, and I don't think that we can have high oil prices. And I actually heard this on BBC before I was coming over here, is that the World Bank said this exact thing, and I say it in every meeting and every briefing I give with all my clients, to every presentation, every panel, is that we have high oil prices and high everything prices, and people really don't appreciate how bad that is, and that's going to start curbing and eating into demand, and it's going to be problematic. Now, the World Bank was talking about how in the 70s we did this fuel switching, and we won't be doing that, and I sort of disagree, because I think we will be, from nat gas to coal, we'll definitely be burning more coal in the near term. But from the oil perspective, I think it can eat into demand, and that is going to have a cooling effect. But for the administration, for politically, it's not going to be good, because that means the economy is declining. And so it really is a bad situation. You have 8.5% inflation, you have $100 crude oil, and yeah, you suppose we have a strong economy, but we can't get anyone to work. So everything's tight and it's messy, and it's adding to that inflation, and then you're getting further issues from all the global supply chain issues we talked about with China, which is hitting the country on various levels and various sectors. So
it's a perfect storm, really.
Yeah.
And if you look at, when you talk about demand, and I've seen the same numbers as you, that demand is decreasing, and year over year, where we actually have less demand going into the driving season and the summer season than we did last year. And it sounds like a similar story to everything that's happening with the Fed. A lot of the issues that we're seeing on the inflation side are from supply, and the only thing you can really do is control demand. And that's what these prices are doing in terms of gas, is controlling demand. And basically people are just driving less. They're choosing to, I don't know if they're choosing to fly less. I've seen prices for flights these days.
No, and if you've been to DAA, I mean, it's crazy. So I don't think we've really seen the prices impact, the straight up gasoline prices impact the consumer in the U.S. Because people always say, okay, well, adjusting for inflation, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the issue now is that if you have $4 gasoline and you have 8.5% inflation, which will probably be more like 10% inflation, I mean, going to the grocery store is where you feel it the most. I mean, coming back, went to the grocery store on Sunday, and I order my groceries, so, which you still feel it there, but going to the grocery store and you barely fill up your bags and it's $200.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really serious. So for a family that's you're trying to feed, multiple people, this is really, really serious. So it's the high everything prices, and it's that gasoline in the summer, depending on how things look in the summer and how confident the consumer is, and also where they see inflation. So inflation has a lot to do with inflation expectations, and this is why when people get really excited about wages going up, you should not get excited, because
it's going to make it worse.
Yeah, it does. And wage price spirals are like something the Fed is quite fearful of, which they should have been fearful of a year ago. But those wage price spirals...
But inflation was transitory.
Yes, even though...
Didn't you hear?
It wasn't. It wasn't month over month. And at least on the record, on this podcast, I have talked about inflation since the beginning of last year.
Timestamp it. We'll go back and say...
It's February of last year, but it's really scary, because the month over month, people think it might be peaking, but it's like, okay, well, where does it peak at? 10%. But I think in the summer, and as we're looking into these forward months, and I talk, about mortgage rates and the economy and everything. I would like to get into that too, but it all feeds into like the health of the consumer. So if the consumer doesn't feel good and is not healthy, and people say, well, everybody's got lots of money in their savings accounts and everything, and the home prices are up, and okay, that's one thing, but there's multiple factors that drive oil demand. And so oil demand growth is a big factor in oil prices. And so I don't think, like, IEA came out and was talking about oil demand declining a little bit. But if you saw their data, it was sort of their month over month data from March to April was that they actually, so March was like, hey, we revised demand up for 2021. April was we actually revised demand down for 2021. So it's all over the place. And demand globally is always backward you're always revising it, and it's backward looking. OPEC came out in April and said that they were concerned. So they actually cited sovereign debt, concerns over potentially sovereign debt levels, which is huge. I mean, debt in general is just huge globally. And really, I mean, people need to start looking at emerging markets. And I know lots of bulls, lots of folks on Wall Street are always like really pushing emerging markets, but emerging markets are, unless you're exporting crude oil, you're hurting really, really badly from grain price increases, from fuel price increases. And the same thing can be said for the U.S. consumer, is when prices go up at the grocery store and prices go up for gasoline. We'll just see how the summer people feel. I think there's still enough pent-up demand where people have been, stuck in their homes for so long, or just didn't seeing their families, and so they're going to eat it. But at some point, they're going to stop eating they're going to realize I don't need that nice thing. And I think Netflix was a nice the earnings for Netflix could have been an indicator there of they said they lost 200,000 subscribers. Obviously, it was kind of the beginning of this tech cycle, which was going to come. I always say Kathy Wood's like tech all the time, and it just doesn't work. But Netflix declined 200,000 users, and that doesn't seem like a ton, but it was the first time they've actually declined users. Well, you could think about they raised prices, so it's like around $20 a month. And if you think about even just those 200,000 users, if they're saying, "Hey, I don't think I need this," or I'm
going to share my password until you come get me,
right?
Whenever that happens,
all that is, and it's like and they said there were several million users doing that, but the reality is like if this is considered not. And it's not a need to have item, and that's where things start hurting. And I think it was over a year ago when Jim Cramer was on CNBC and he's talking about Chipotle, and he's just saying, well, inflation it's not a problem because somebody will just open up another place and it'll be cheaper. And I thought that's not how this works, and people will stop. I still am ordering Chipotle, not as much though, because it's the cost of ordering a really nice salad from like Sweetgreen, and they're equivalent. So it's like, or it's like, do I go to the grocery store and do I get the meal, or do I just go to a nicer restaurant and pay slightly, more? But if I'm paying, $30 for Chipotle with chips and guac and everything, that's not the benefit to like what it was. And I still think that, and I'm simplifying that for listeners, but I think a lot of folks on the younger side, you're saving money. You're buying Chipotle was at $10 at one point, and then it's $15, and so it's the same thing with Netflix though. Is that this was a nice to have, and it's nice. Is it needed, or is it a nice to have? And I think if you're paying a lot of money at the pump and you're paying a lot of money at the grocery store, people are going to start cutting back. So I really do think the summer is going to be an important time to watch. How people are driving, and I think it's going to be fine. I don't think demand is going to come off a cliff, but I think the health of the consumer and how they think inflation is going to be and how they feel is going to be really, really important.
Yeah, and to your point about 10% CPI, was it wholesale CPI? Is it 10% going forward? Those are maybe previous numbers.
Yeah, I think it's if you break out. So the whole number for the latest number we have, so we'll get the new number, but it's 8.5% was the latest number. We should be getting a new one, which is expected to be around 10%. But if you break out the individual categories and you chart it, and you can do this on the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics and just pulling up the charts, you see certain trends, and they're quite clear. It's like go look at 2007, go look at 2008, and see how it looked then. We have higher prices for beef and most food items than we had at that time. And natural gas prices, I think, are really, really important. I'm actually I'm more concerned about natural gas prices impacting the consumer than I am necessarily about $4 at the pump. And that's because if you're looking back to 2007, 2008 levels, we had these price spikes, and we had lots of inflation and problems with the economy and housing. But natural gas prices it's electricity. So electricity prices have continued to increase for the last, if you chart that on U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, they steadily are rising. And electricity prices it's very serious. If your natural gas is going up, just like in Europe, obviously it's such a bigger deal than we appreciate here because we have so much of it. But if we're even seeing it, their bills are absolutely going through the roof. And so the idea that this, anybody resistant to the concept of we could have a recession, which is just 2 consecutive quarters of declining growth. I mean, we're going to have a recession. It's going to happen. And we just kind of been bamboozled by this crazy growth that we had in coming out of COVID in 2021 that was ridiculous. And this, trillions of dollars, like 27 trillion sloshing around the global economy that just has sort of fueled all this stuff. But I still am concerned, like even with when people keep saying, and I heard it tonight before I left and was listening to Bloomberg, but the consumer is still good. The consumer still has all the savings.
Someone should talk to a consumer. That's what I want to say.
Yeah.
Like, really, how out of touch are you?
Yeah, and it's all that. It's like, well, do I want to spend all the money in savings? Like, I will. People will have to do that. I mean, families will do that. But that's the point of where if they're spending their money in savings, they may not be spending on other stuff like Netflix or these other things, and that all has these compounding ripple effects in the economy. And when I hear stock advisors start to say, like, hey, look at Target instead of, the fancy fangled tech, it's like Target and Walmart and all these other stocks, because those are the ones that do well when things are doing a little more poorly and you're going to the cheaper stuff. So it's just you cannot separate the consumer and the health of the economy and commodity stuff at all. And they all fold into each other. And economic growth and the economy do really well when prices are low and stable, not when prices are high and inflation is going bananas.
Right, and then we've had 50 basis point hike from the Fed.
Bringing it back to that. Yeah,
bringing it back to the Fed. And I think last time I had mortgage rates at 5.25. Again, this is probably last week. These are old numbers. And how that all impacts everything when people are paying more for their mortgages, when people are paying higher interest rates, when people are paying higher gas prices and they're paying higher heating prices and higher electricity costs, and how that all factors in. And what particularly gripes me, and maybe, I'm going on my own tangent, is you hear the Biden administration looking at U.S. oil and gas producers and saying, well, you need to drill more, and this is on you, and don't be price gouging, and don't hurt the consumer. We are the only prong in this wheel that's coming off the hinges as far as I'm concerned. And it really has no bearing of truth. And I want to get your thoughts on that in particular, and you can circle back to the Fed and how you think the Fed's hasn't handled things.
I think we'll start with the Fed and go into housing, because I spend a lot of time talking to folks now about this housing piece, which I think is really, really important, and rising mortgage rates, because I had to do my taxes and was just talking to my accountant, and we were talking about mortgage rates today and the thousands of people who have been laid off in the mortgage industry because refi, and part of it is because the refi boom was so great because mortgage rates were so low over the past couple of years. But we've seen mortgage rates go from 3.2% in January to last week being 5.25%. You're correct, but now we're probably pushing. I had seen it was 5.35, but if you and I were actually to try to get a mortgage today, I guarantee it's going to be way higher than that. So what you see on the sticker price is very different than what you actually have to get. And so if you put it on Google and you put the various cities, it is, you're seeing like 6%. And that's where you start having to look back at the 2007, 2008 levels. And no, we don't have as many adjustable rate mortgages out there, but there are some. And yes, and a lot of those mortgages are better or healthier than they were in 2007, 2008. So, now, if you have a Pulse, you can get an Escalade. But back then, if you had a Pulse, you could get a house. I mean, I do encourage people to watch The Big Short because it's not perfect, but it's a great summary.
Yeah, good movie.
It's a great summary.
Very entertaining.
It's very entertaining. Very entertaining movie. But it does if you followed anything with the financial crisis, just what happened in housing was huge. But something really important to point out then is 2007, 2008, the average home price was around $300,000. The average home price in the U.S. now is $500,000, and the average mortgage is roughly that size. So we know in Denver the average home price is $700,000, and people just a few years ago were freaking out when it was average home price was $400,000. So the speed at which the increase has been dramatic, and we didn't even see that ramp up or that scale in that crisis. So when people...
Can I clarify, real quick on the list price? So when you say $700,000, and I don't know the numbers, I just was with a friend who list price was $550, I think they paid $700. So when we say average price, is that average list price or average sale price?
It's the average, so it's the average sale price. Okay. And then if you look at new home sales, so I've actually, and it's really important for oil, and I don't know if I get the reaction. I feel like it's a big deal, but you can chart new home prices and you can chart U.S. home prices and U.S. oil demand, and they move in perfect lockstep with each other, literally perfect lockstep. So they go up together and they come down together, and I would bet my ass that they are going to come down together. I'm not saying that demand is going to crater or housing prices will crater, but the escalation in housing prices is not sustainable. It simply is not sustainable because you can go around Denver, and I saw it all last summer and prior, like in my neighborhood, of seeing these couples walk around, and they're like, they look fear in their eyes because they're going to buy a $800,000 house, and they're pushing themselves like, should they be buying a $800,000 house? Well, that's $200,000 more than they thought they were going to buy the house for. They're going to do it anyway because they're worried about getting pushed out and they won't be having it. Well, all that's great when you both have jobs and everything's working smoothly. But if you also start looking like, so the Fed has put out great data on housing. And the biggest concerning factor for me, despite this, everybody saying help the consumer, is the amount of debt. Is that when these housing prices are so much money, your mortgage bills are higher, right? Your actual bills are higher. So your flexibility to quit your job, maneuver jobs, one person not working, it changes a lot. And I came out of school, and I know you're a bit younger than me, but I came out of school in the heart of the recession, and that was real, high unemployment, and you couldn't get jobs. And I had people 10 years older than me that were getting, not internships, but entry level jobs, and that's what I was competing with, and it was very scary because it's like I don't know what I'm going to do. But those were families that couldn't find jobs either and were willing to take anything. So this concept, very similar to how we think about crude oil prices, is we sort of like, this is what's going on now, so this is what it has to be in the future. People think about that the way with the economy as well, and I think that the average person and family and consumers have to get savvy of realizing that they do need that savings, and with these bigger mortgage bills, so we added $1 trillion in debt. In the U.S. households added $1 trillion in debt in 2021 alone, and that is the single largest increase since 2007. That's because these mortgage rates and because of cars and everything are so high. But $1 trillion in debt for U.S. households is huge.
That's insane.
It's just a huge number. So those debt levels are, and obviously it just keeps, like, we had a peak in 2007, 2008, kind of came off, and then it's just been rising ever since. And so I just think those prices are really important. And then when mortgage rates go up, and going from 3% something and change to 5.4%, and we haven't even had our first real rate hike yet.
Yeah, like the Fed hasn't done anything but basically say, hey, we're going to.
Yep. Yeah, so we're going to, and so it's already raising, and I think it was 2 weeks ago, the monthly mortgage payment went up 20%. So from a year ago. So that figure in itself, meaning that you have significantly less money to spend on other stuff, and
we haven't even touched inflation at that
exactly.
point.
Yeah.
We haven't touched gas prices.
That's just a reality. Is that people's mortgage payments are higher than they were before, bar none. That's it. And unless and I do not believe that people who are I know lots of people in Denver. Denver's a unique place, and you have lots of people from the East Coast and West Coast, and it's still cheaper. But let's just say the rest of the country, when your home prices have went up that much, if your income has not went up that much, then it's a different story. And then you have all these other inflationary pieces. So you just have less discretionary income. And I don't think Netflix dropping 200,000 users is the end of the story of some things. And the fact that, like, Netflix, we're all pretty addicted to it. So if they're declining at all, they're not adding. They could have flatlined, but it's saying something.
It's an indicator for sure. And what you're saying really reminds me of, just anecdotally, in my millennial group chat with my friends, we had a conversation the other day about, how do you ask your boss for an 8% cost of living adjustment and an 8% raise based on inflation? And should I be asking for 10%? And should I walk if I don't get that because the market's so hot and I'm in tech and someone will pay me more and someone will match that? And I think it was just a really good anecdotal story of, this is what's happening with wage inflation. And a lot of my generation, our generation, are expecting this, and if they don't get it, they're going to walk. And if they don't get it and they don't walk, their bills are going to be a lot more painful.
So that's fantastic, and I am going to put your age. How old are you?
I'm 27. Let's timestamp this.
I'm 36, so we have, oh my gosh, I'm 10 years older than you. So anyways, so big generational gap there, but I am fascinated by this sort of millennial piece, or actually you're Gen Z, I believe, right?
I'm technically a millennial, but I've had disagreements with some folks on my board about it because I'm on the very tail end. I'm
technically a millennial. I'm not a good one. I'm not an average millennial. But anyways, despite that, I think this the labor force piece is really important. I want to and make sure we get back to the Fed stuff, because I think that I want to touch on the Fed and what they're doing or not doing, and with the implications for that and why it matters for oil prices and everything. But this U.S. I think U.S. labor is one piece, but we're seeing it all over the world. So we're seeing this lack of drivers, lack of people, working on. I would say not lack of people working, but there has to be a lack of people working if we don't have enough truck drivers. If we don't have enough people working, we saw this in the UK where they were short almost 200,000 truck drivers, which was huge. And I think it was Boris Johnson who had said, or somebody,
good old Boris.
Somebody in the UK had said, "Hey, don't ask for a wage increase, and you'll help cool inflation." And it's like, okay, well,
not my problem. Why don't you figure it out? Why don't you do a better job at managing the economic policy of our country?
I think when people see these, but when people see hey, prices or wages are going up, it's really not something that anybody you really want to see. As an economist, I think people have lost it, given that we have so much, at least at the beginning of this administration, and so much more of a democratic sort of socialist regime in office that was very excited about, raising wages and everything. It's like most economists are pretty split on this of, do you want to see higher wages or increase the minimum wage? Because that always gets passed along to the consumer, and then prices just go up. So the people who, and this is the saddest part to me, is the people who want and I'm not talking about necessarily your peers, and I want to get to that, but the people on the lower end who are seeing minimum wages increase and seeing wages increase are feeling the brunt of inflation the most. And so it is a spiraling effect, and it is awful. So the people on the lower end spectrum, inflation hits them the worst, and inflation is for a number of reasons, but it is absolutely part because we have growth in entitlement programs and trillions of dollars. We had this administration and Congress wrote checks like a drunken sailor for a year in the midst of all this stuff. And I do believe that economists were intelligent enough to understand that this would cause inflation. And we know this because when we were starting with stimulus measures and all these COVID freakouts, people would say, we don't have to be worried about inflation because these are not entitlement programs and long-term spending. When it gets into long-term spending, then we have some problems. And so that's where it's not all from that. I mean, there's many, many things in the global economy that are causing inflation. But certainly the U.S. has led inflation, and we have been we've been right up with Turkey and Brazil in terms of the rate of inflation. And that is a category that you just don't want to be in. I mean, it's quite scary. So I think that gets into this fiscal lag. I really think when people start talking about why people aren't working. So basic question I always get is why can't we find people to work in the field? Yeah. There is a fiscal lag. I think to your point about this, there's a generation, but not even generational. It is just a shift in how people are thinking about working, and a lot of people retiring, people staying home to have kids, the cost of daycare being expensive, all these things. And I was on a panel last week with these two women, and one was the general counsel for Black Mountain Sand. And both these women were telling me about their respective businesses to this group at the Texas Energy Council Symposium, and they were talking about how there is a real shift in how people are thinking about work, and how the woman Kelly Roach was talking about how some of the men are okay going to the office every day because they're leaving the kids and everything home, and she was kind of joking about it, but she was saying that everyone sort of adapted some degree of you can work from home this day or that day. And I think COVID has changed how, and I do not believe nothing is permanent, and we always shift back into things. So COVID did a lot of things to a lot of people, and it jarred people's perception. It had a severe impact to the oil and gas market. But this idea that people will never go back to the office, or that people will not travel. I mean, at the end of 2020, all the oil economists in the world said that oil demand for business travel would never recover. And
the other day they're now coming out. Oh, business travel is back. It's totally fine. No one's worried.
Right. And I think that business travel will actually probably have to, if the economy is backsliding, business travel will probably increase in a lot of ways because you will be competing. It is a bigger deal for me. I would rather be in front of a client and talking to them and briefing them in person than doing a Zoom meeting. It is not the same. And if I have to compete for that, I'm sure as hell going to be in person, because it's a lot different than saying, oh, we'll just do it from my computer. And there's a presence that's different from doing this podcast together. Is very different than if we had done it on Zencastr. Would have been easier with the button because we had a lot of technical issues. But that being said, I mean, there's a significant difference, but I do want to get back to this and ask you about this. Your generation, these people, you're not that far out of college, so this has been a few years out of college. Yeah. But all these people if you had student debt, you haven't had to pay it, and it just got extended through August. So we're talking sometimes several $100s, if not more, a month in student debt.
Usually much more.
Yeah, so that hasn't been paid. So that's when we talk about these fiscal lags and people's comfort in the ability to switch jobs. It's like, well, how would you feel if you had $1,000, if that payment that you had before or never had and you will have eventually hit you? How would you feel about that? How flexible would you feel about? Because I think these fiscal lags have let people feel flexible. And I'm not saying necessarily it directly correlates to the work thing, but asking for wage increases because your cost of living is going up. It's like, well, I got a newsflash for everyone. I can't do that. I get prices increased to me, but I run my own business, and I don't go to them and say, okay, the speaking fee increased by X percentage because of inflation. That's just not, it's not appropriate for business, and I don't want to do that.
That's nice, because I will say I definitely have seen a significant amount of invoices come across my desk that have, one of them the other day doubled. I was like, what in the world?
Yeah, I mean, and people are doing it. People are passing it along, and I tell my dog guy that takes care of Axel when I'm traveling. He had increased it, and I said, look, I appreciate that you're doing that, and I said I will, but I'm going to meet you halfway. And I said, because I'm not doing that to people. I'm not doing that to businesses. I don't feel it's not right. It's not appropriate, because then you got to realize that businesses are not making more money. They're spending more money. So when people are asking for these wage price increases, that's the wage price spiral that gets really out of hand. And I'm not saying they shouldn't necessarily, their cost of living is going up and everything. I'm saying that's a reality. But to switch jobs based upon it is a very short-lived, a short-term phenomenon that may not last.
That's a millennial, right? You know, we're like flip to one place to the next, which is a generalization, but sometimes true.
But it used to be that you didn't want to flip jobs it wasn't good to have on your resume that you had switched jobs every year. And we've definitely seen during COVID where people are just job hopping like crazy.
They're entitled. Everyone's entitled, myself included. So let's circle back to, you made a comment about the Fed and Fed policy and its impact on energy prices.
Yes.
And I want you to just rant.
Okay. So I mean, and hopefully we clarified that fiscal lag. So in addition to students, not the debt payment, it's also that if you haven't paid rent or whatever. So I do think fiscal lags are very serious in terms of everyone into the workforce. So lots of stuff going on there. But the Fed side, and the Fed is relevant to that because we're just reducing our quantitative easing. So there's still quantitative easing in the system and reducing, and haven't even got to the Fed balance sheet, but the Fed was still buying mortgage-backed securities. So the fact that you have housing prices to the level that they're at and the spending and the craziness in housing, and you're still buying mortgage-backed securities, it doesn't add up. But the Fed has been, I think I'd heard, and it was on Bloomberg, and I told somebody on an interview earlier this week being yesterday, on a podcast about Jerome Powell has been said to be one of the most politically savvy Fed chairs, meaning that he really knows, he isn't taking the cues from the administration. That's not like they're calling him up and saying, do this, but he is savvy interpreting them, and he did not become more hawkish until he was reinstated as Fed chair. And I know people don't want to say that, but it's just a reality. Like, he didn't actually start talking about raising interest rates until his job was secure. And you have Elizabeth Warren, who just came out and said, hey, if we don't curb inflation, we might lose the midterms. Shocking.
You're like, wow, newsflash, flip and flash.
you've had month over month. If you pull up the inflation numbers, that's what Jerome Powell last summer, I walk the dog and I'm listening to Jerome Powell speak, and the live stuff, and I take listening to that stuff really seriously. But it's like, he's like, if we have month over month inflation, then we have a problem. And it's like, we have had month over month inflation up until that point, and then we've had it. So when he a couple months ago or a month ago, when he's talking, he says, hindsight's 20/20. If we knew then what we knew now, and it's like,
you should have known.
But each time it went up, every 2 months it went up. Then you could have said we should have done something. And now the real problem, and what's really scary, is that, and why the risk of recession is high, is that you have to cool off the economy now, and you can't control all of it because all of that inflation.
You can't control supply, right? So you've got to control demand.
Right. So you're Well, and you have to attempt to do something because one, if you don't raise rates, you can't lower them either when things are really bad. So you have no tools in your toolbox. So you should have been raising even a little bit, quarter of a point. The fact that they didn't do it, that scares me from a political point of that there was some real ass kissing there. And it is really wrong to me that we weren't even doing small increases. And historically speaking, at these inflation levels, we're in 1970s level inflation and oil price. I mean, we're in Bananaville territory. And the fact that the Fed didn't do emergency meetings to say, hey, we're raising quarter point now, that we haven't even had it. Everybody's talking about it. It's like, you could have already done it. You could have come out and you could have said, hey, you know what? We may do a 50 basis point hike. We may do 0.50, but we're going to do 25 right now in this emergency meeting and let the market interpret it, let it swallow it, let it deal with it, and then move on and see how it reacts.
It probably would have reacted well. The first rate hike, it always surges up and goes positive.
But you have the market is basically the Fed is supposed to signal what they're going to do, and the market interprets it and feeds, hence mortgage rates, everything. It's like it's already moving, right? And that's the problem is with the yield curves and having inverted yield curves. It's like an inverted yield curve signals recession, and so people are like, well, I don't know.
Causation, correlation. I'm like, bitch about it and come back to me later.
Well, and there's this thing called Phillips Curve. And at London School of Economics, we were all nerds, so, but they had like a t-shirt at LSE and it was like the Phillips Curve. And it's like, the Phillips Curve is inflation and unemployment. And Switzerland was always on, like you wanted to be Switzerland because Switzerland always had low inflation and low unemployment. Low inflation, low unemployment. Well, we had that. So, and people don't realize that, look at where oil prices were at when we had low inflation and low unemployment. And yes, it took us, not every economic and business cycle is completely attributable to the president, but the president and Congress have an ability to help it. They can help it one direction or the other. And something that happened under Obama is that they didn't actually spend like drunken sailors, and they didn't do crazy stimulus. And in many ways, that was probably a good thing. But they didn't actually support enough stuff, maybe from a tax perspective and business side, to really get the economy really, really jolted. But at the same time, we didn't see crazy inflation levels. And then when Trump came in, it was on the upswing. And but on all of that, we had, especially in Trump, we had very lower and stable oil prices. And at the end of Obama, and production was coming up. So one, we had some jobs from that, but also lower oil prices were significant. And I have done a lot of research on this. I've charted this. So you can look at GDP growth, look at GDP growth, and look at oil demand changes. They track really tightly together. So that's globally. But if you break it down on a country level, the countries that are really important to look at are developed economies like the U.S., like Germany, like Japan, because China and India will just demand crude oil regardless of the price of crude oil because their economies were going up. That's not going to be the case going forward, but which is a whole nother thing. But when you
another podcast, someone said.
It's all in the podcast. But when you look at developed countries like the U.S., low, stable, sub 60 or around $60 oil prices were meaningful for the U.S. economy because it was. People were it helped people spending. It also helped businesses. And you also had, and I don't want to get into the politics, but you did have a lowering taxes is like you signal to business, hey, business, we're here for you. But it was also oil and gas industry, go to town, and prices were lower. That was actually really meaningful for Germany because Germany was is a industrial powerhouse. So lower energy prices for them were significant in terms of their economy. And you can just chart it and see what their demand looked like when prices were lower. Demand did well. Well, newsflash, folks, Europe's going to be they're hurting really bad, and this is going to have massive ramifications for people from just being able to consume energy, but also the output that these countries can do in wartime.
Right? And there's no end in sight to any of these problems.
Yeah.
And I do want to touch on U.S. production before we wrap up here. And, I know we talked about a little bit earlier offline, Liberty and Halliburton's earnings calls, and I think last time I checked, frac spread count was somewhere between 285 and 290, which is kind of where it's hovered, with 20% dual simul-frac. And I wanted to get your thoughts on kind of industry, and if you think, we can't see a huge increase in anything coming online because horsepower is pretty maxed out at this point, from my understanding. But I do want to get your thoughts on DUC counts, on frac spread, on some predictions going forward.
So that's how Gabby wants to wrap this up. Of like, that's a
I know. I'm like, let's wrap it up
with your favorite topic ever.
With the topic that we go for now.
No, we will, and this will go a smidge longer, but we'll close it with that. And those are make sure we hit all those. But so both earnings calls were good. I mean, they were positive in terms of Liberty's was very, very positive. So was Halliburton's. I disagreed with Halliburton's sort of take on the way they were looking at sort of the macro environment and geopolitics. So I still think, I mean, we haven't had a slug of earnings calls, but pre-earnings season, and I've been noting this on the podcast and to folks, is I wasn't really happy with the whole, pie in the sky, north is the only direction we can go for oil prices, etc. Because the logic behind it was sort of that it was very demand driven. There wasn't a lot of credence paid to the geopolitical tensions. And I really do believe that oil prices today, $20 to $30 of that is strictly geopolitics. So is fear, is a very fear-driven algorithmic trading as opposed to technical supply and demand fundamentals so that's super important. But and so Halliburton was a little bit off, I think, there. However, the story was the same in terms of like, hey, we're gonna start to be able to meaningfully increase pricing. And I talked about this on the podcast with Matt Gallagher and others, is that the service side of the business is incredibly important because, I mean, as people know, like the service sector, if you do or don't know, but if you're in the industry in the U.S. for sure, that is the service sector, the ability of the nimbleness of the service sector really enabled like the U.S. shale boom to happen in the first place, for right or wrong, of burning cash on the upstream side versus also, adding frac fleets like no tomorrow and then, having too much supply. But the reality is that flexibility and that redundancy and that nimbleness of businesses in the service sector really enabled shale to prosper. But these businesses also have to make money. And we've had consolidation in the space, and we've had, depths of despair in obviously 2020 for the business. And so it's recovering from the business. Now, we should not have had that. People should have been drilling and completing wells, not necessarily turning them on production. But that aside, I mean, we shouldn't have had that. And I certainly hope that this industry, if prices drop to 80 tomorrow, that they really take a lot of consideration how they slow this down. But that being said, on Liberty's call, I love Chris Wright. But I have to say, I mean, he opened up his earnings call the way I have been speaking on panels and talking a lot lately of just like, this is an energy crisis. This energy crisis started in 2021. And he's like, but that aside, we'll get into the earnings. But they obviously take, energy security, energy poverty very seriously. And so he does fold in his business, though, of saying, hey, we're fracking. I mean, we're in the business, things are growing, we're doing this. And so if you actually pull that to a macro perspective, from a macro being U.S. macro, activity is up, right? Everybody is adding. And so when we talk about these labor shortages, which they do talk about their earnings call, and we talk about sand tightness, which both of them talked about being in the first part of this year was really, really big, but it's been somewhat alleviated, so people are getting it. When we talk about all that, like, I always say, look, the rig count, and the rig count's less relevant now, but it's still really relevant because we're nearing where we were pre-COVID. We're not quite there, but these rigs are doing far more with less. They're
longer laterals.
Oh my gosh, these lateral lengths.
It's insane.
It's absolutely insane. When you're looking at these companies that are 15,000 foot here, 15,000 foot there, and then it's also like your average lateral length in the Midland, I believe, is about 13,000 foot. So
it's like you can't even see the rig once you
stand at the end. You're just that's your average. And so that means that a lot of companies have blocked up their acreage, and that means that so you have these longer laterals, and so there's a lot of efficiency gains from that. And you have multi-pad. More companies are having more wells on a pad, and you have to think about it, because if you listen to earnings calls and you had listened to earnings calls for a decade, you would have thought that we should have been simul-fracking several years ago, but we weren't because companies only got to the point quite recently where they had 6 wells on a pad. And so it wasn't on average, you didn't have the perfect little Exxon 20 wells on a pad, just mow it down. Like, that wasn't everyone. So now that the point that we're at this sort of stage that is game changing. And I think that was, but the real takeaway for me in both earnings calls was pricing, was that, there's multiple dynamics to why service pricing will increase. And that's that you definitely have overall inflation, but also that it's just a step up, right? It's the activity is stepping up. And so the industry is the oil and gas industry, you have to sort of appreciate outside inflation for all the components. I mean, like chemicals and everything, but you also have to appreciate when oil prices go up, they have inflation because a lot of their components and their use to fueling their equipment is energy
Pipe's
prices.
significantly more expensive these days.
So yeah, that's not
steel pipe, steel casing.
So steel pipe, steel casing, if you can even get it, and the people side. But even then, when you have high oil prices and you have everybody ramping up drilling, the drilling side and the completion side also feels that, because so much of your business involves parts of the energy, right? You're fueling your rigs with diesel or net gas or like any component, even just if pretend it's free green electricity, there's still a cost component to it. So all of it, energy prices impacts the ability to produce energy. So the industry is quite flexible in understanding. I would say flexible, but oil and gas industry understands that very well in terms of how inflation works. This is something I think really important in terms of how the price increases are working, though, is that activity is ramping up. Has been ramping up for the better part of 2 years. Private operators were leading the way with that, and they've continued to do so because they don't have
the requirements on them.
Yeah, they don't have the requirement. They don't have the ESG and investor pressure, and so they have a lot more flexibility. And because at these oil prices, $100 oil, everything looks pretty damn good. And that's something that neither talked about, but I really do think that I'm surprised we haven't heard of people talking about, that tier 4 acreage is terrible. It's like, well, whatever your tier 4 acreage, and you can see on a map, you can just see where private companies are drilling, is that you have so much actual acreage and availability at these oil prices. So I would say you don't bet against U.S. oil production or nat gas production, or don't bet against the industry. And I think Liberty's call was sort of case in point of that if they're able to sort of steadily increase these prices, and the service sector is able to begin to make some money. That's important. They do need to make money, because you need a sustainable service sector to have a sustainable upstream sector. Everybody needs to sort of work in tandem. Now, if you get to these places where you start adding too many frac fleets, that'll be a problem. But companies like, I think Liberty was talking about, that they're not adding, like, they're not going to bring on a electric frac fleet unless they have unless they have somebody on the other side that absolutely wants that. So I would say we continue to evolve in the service sector, and we will continue to evolve that. We'll continue to evolve pricing. Oh, and the comment about sand that they said that they...
Yeah, that was interesting. I didn't realize
that. The decoupling. So, and this is why I say the business evolves, and I love this point of that. So if you're not paying attention to it, you're going to miss it, because we went from a few years ago, several years ago, where everything went through the service company, right? Your sand, your chemicals, everything. And then the operators were like, oh, no, let's decouple. Let's separate everything, and it took a lot. It took a lot out of the service sector too, because they I wouldn't say they're passing along the cost, but it was definitely a point of, there are margins there. So there's a reason why the operator did. They're buying their own sand, they're buying their chemicals, and then they're just using the service provider. So you're sort of you're decoupling everything. And now Liberty was mentioning that they have control of the sand, that it actually was in their favor. It worked in their favor because these operators needed sand and they couldn't get it. And this logistics and last mile, which when you can't get a truck driver and you can't get anyone to work in the field, that's a pretty big deal. So I do think that, as you ebb and flow with the industry, like, these things change. So we could go back to, we in theory could go back to seeing a little bit more of and I would say integration to a degree of sand and chemicals, for example, because the operators are having a hard time finding it, and you would have, service providers that may be able to do, or at least even just spending the time on it. So I think it's relevant, and if they can make sure they have the trucks on the road and the people in the field.
So I think that's a good place to wrap up for a time perspective. And at another time, we're going to dig into a lot more on the U.S. production side. But this has been such a robust conversation. And I just really appreciate getting the opportunity to pick your brain. And I'm hopeful that we can do it again. Because for everyone listening, I'm sure you share my same sentiment that Trisha really is the brains of the operation. And it's nice to give you space to really run with some things.
I appreciate that. So, and that was fun. That was fun being a guest on my podcast. So that was awesome. And you were great at the interview questions. And we will have to have another one, because we didn't even get into the nerdy stuff.
I know, we didn't get into the nitty gritty.
Yeah.
So we're going to do it again.
We will do it again.
Coming to your podcast next.
Yes.
What did we call me? A fliparoo?
A fliparoo.
Another fliparoo.
Yes, another fliparoo. Well, thank you so much, Gabby. It was an absolute pleasure. And thank you guys for listening. And we will see you next week. Bye, guys.